understand.
As simple as that.
How can you make me understand when you got me in handcuffs? Think about it.
I'm asking you simple questions and you want to be...
No, bro.
Be a smart ass about it.
I'm not being a smart ass. You got me in handcuffs and I'm not... I have no warrant. I have nothing. What law have I broken?
Walk right here.
The encounter does not begin with chaos. It begins with a logistical explanation, delivered as if it were routine. Officers describe a vehicle stopped near the interstate, a child in the back seat, a decision already made to pull the driver away from the roadway and relocate the interaction. From the outset, control is asserted through movement. The driver is no longer simply stopped, he is repositioned. That choice, subtle and procedural on its surface, is the first moment where authority quietly expands beyond observation and into management. What follows is not an immediate allegation of a crime. There is no clear articulation of a traffic violation unfolding in real time. Instead, the focus drifts quickly to identity, geography, and belonging. Where the man is from, why he is here, whether he fits an unspoken expectation of place. These questions, while framed casually, carry weight. They signal a shift away from objective enforcement and towards subjective assessment. The encounter becomes less about what happened and more about who this person is perceived to be. The man responds by anchoring himself to normalcy. He emphasizes family ties, local connections, and parental responsibility. His language repeatedly circles back to legitimacy. He is not transient, not involved in criminal enterprise, not hiding. He is situating himself within a framework officers are supposed to recognize as non-threatening. This is a common survival instinct in police encounters, demonstrating social credibility as a buffer against escalation. But credibility does not recalibrate the officer's posture. Instead, the interaction accelerates. An instruction is issued for him to walk back to the patrol car. At this moment, the legal tone of the stop subtly changes. Walking a subject away from their vehicle and closer to a police car often signals detention rather than a brief investigative stop. The man resists not physically, but verbally, asking for justification. He frames his refusal around the absence of wrongdoing, asserting that without a clear legal basis, he will not comply. This is the first true friction point. The officer interprets non-compliance not as a legal question, but as defiance. Authority, once challenged, seeks reinforcement. The language hardens. The distance between instruction and command collapses. What was optional becomes mandatory without explanation. The man insists he is not being aggressive. He repeats it, as if repetition might slow the situation down. It does not. Physical positioning becomes the new language of power. The officer's close space. The man is directed toward the vehicle. His hands, his posture, his proximity to the car are now being controlled. He attempts to de-escalate by offering transparency, expressing willingness to be searched, stating explicitly that he is not resisting. These are not the words of someone attempting to flee or fight. They are the words of someone trying to regain procedural footing inside a system that has already decided to move forward without him. The hook moment, the one selected for the opening of this documentary, captures this exact transition. In those seconds, authority shifts from asserted to enforced. The commands are no longer conditional. The man's physical autonomy is replaced by imposed positioning. The interaction crosses from verbal dispute into physical control, not because a crime has been articulated, but because compliance has not been immediate. This moment matters because it reveals how escalation often works in practice. It is not triggered by danger, but by challenge. The system reacts less to threat than to hesitation. From here, the encounter unfolds along a predictable but deeply troubling path. The man's repeated declarations of calm are interpreted as irrelevant. His attempts to explain are framed as obstruction. His insistence on rights is treated as provocation. Each time he speaks, the officers respond not to the content of his words, but to the fact that he is still speaking. The presence of a child in the vehicle looms over everything, though it is rarely addressed directly in a way that prioritizes care. Instead, the child becomes a secondary justification, an abstract concern, rather than a protected individual. The officers reference responsibility, safety, and procedure, but the immediate environment grows increasingly tense. The emotional temperature rises, while the practical risk to the child remains unresolved. As the man is seated and controlled, the dynamic crystallizes. He is no longer a participant in a conversation, he is an object of process. His role is to wait, comply, and accept whatever administrative path is chosen for him. The officers begin discussing next steps as if he is not present. Phone numbers are requested. External agencies are referenced. Decisions about the child's custody are floated aloud. This is where the psychological pressure intensifies. For many parents, the threat of losing access to their child even temporarily is more destabilizing than arrest. The man reacts emotionally, not violently, but passionately. His language becomes sharper. He frames himself not just as a compliant citizen, but as an involved father. He resists the implication that he is unfit or negligent. His response is raw because the stakes have changed. The encounter is no longer about him alone. The officers, however, treat this reaction as further evidence of instability. Emotional expression is folded into the narrative of non-compliance. The more he asserts his identity as a parent, the more the system frames him as a problem to be managed. This is a critical institutional failure point. Law enforcement training often emphasizes emotional control, but it rarely equips officers to distinguish between emotional distress and threat. In this case, the inability or unwillingness to make that distinction fuels escalation. Throughout this phase, legal thresholds remain murky. Reasonable suspicion is implied but not articulated. Probable cause is not clearly established, yet the consequences stack up regardless. Detention becomes normalized. Separation from the child becomes plausible. External intervention becomes likely. None of this requires a criminal charge to proceed. The system does not need guilt, it only needs momentum. The man continues to assert that he has done nothing wrong. He emphasizes his availability for checks, records, verification. He does not attempt to flee. He does not threaten. He does not refuse lawful orders once they are physically enforced. Still, the tone of the encounter suggests that cooperation, once delayed, no longer counts. Compliance after resistance is treated as insufficient. This reveals a deeper truth about authority misuse. In many encounters, the goal is not safety or resolution, but submission. Once submission is delayed, the system seeks to reassert dominance, even if doing so escalates harm. The body camera captures this not through dramatic violence, but through procedural coldness. The absence of empathy is as impactful as the presence of force. As officers discuss child welfare involvement, the language shifts again. What was initially framed as concern becomes inevitability. The man's objections are dismissed. His emotional responses are reframed as instability. This creates a feedback loop. Distress justifies intervention, and intervention deepens distress. The institutional machinery now fully engages. Radios crackle. Codes are referenced. The scene expands beyond the original stop. What began as a roadside interaction has become a multi-agency event. The child, still present in the vehicle, is now central to a process unfolding without parental consent. The father's role is reduced to that of a risk factor. This is not an aberration. It is a pattern seen repeatedly in bodycam footage across jurisdictions. Small discretionary decisions moving a vehicle, issuing a command, interpreting hesitation compound into life-altering outcomes. The system rarely pauses to reassess. Each step justifies the next. By the end of this first phase, the power dynamic is complete. The officers control the environment, the narrative, and the timeline. The man's only remaining agency is verbal, and even that is constrained. His earlier attempts to de-escalate are forgotten. His cooperation is overshadowed by the initial challenge. The child's well-being is discussed in procedural terms, not human ones. This documentary does not treat this encounter as a single failure, but as a window into a broader, institutional reality. Accountability is difficult, not because misconduct is invisible, but because it is often subtle. It hides in tone, in sequencing, in what is left unsaid. The body camera does not just record actions, it records priorities. In the next part, the focus will narrow further. We will examine how the invocation of child welfare authority transforms police discretion into near-total control, and how systems designed to protect children can be deployed in ways that punish parents without due process. The escalation here is not loud, but it is relentless, and it is only just beginning. By the time the conversation turns explicitly toward child welfare, the power imbalance is no longer subtle, it is complete. What is striking is not how abruptly this shift occurs, but how casually it is introduced. The mention of contacting child services is framed as a procedural necessity, not a discretionary choice. Language like this matters. It transforms an officer's decision into an inevitability, removing any sense that alternatives exist. At this stage, the man is no longer being evaluated as a driver or even as a detainee. He is being assessed as a parent. That distinction is crucial because the legal standards change dramatically. Criminal law demands clear thresholds: reasonable suspicion, probable cause, articulable facts. Child welfare intervention, however, often operates under a far broader and more subjective standard: perceived risk. This gives officers extraordinary leverage, especially in emotionally charged situations. The man immediately challenges this shift. His reaction is visceral, rooted in identity rather than legality. He does not argue statutes or procedures. He asserts his lived reality as a father who has been present every day of his child's life. This is not performative outrage. It is a natural response to the sudden suggestion that his parental role could be overridden by strangers based on a roadside encounter. But within the logic of the system now engaged, this reaction is counterproductive. Emotion is reinterpreted as instability. Passion is reframed as aggression. The very intensity that underscores his commitment as a parent is used to justify further intervention. This is one of the most dangerous feedback loops in enforcement culture. The more a person cares, the more threatening they appear. The officer's tone remains controlled but detached. They speak about the child as an administrative problem to be solved. Who can pick her up? What agency should be notified? What protocol applies? The father is present, but his perspective is no longer central. He is talked around rather than talked to. This procedural sidelining is not accidental. It is how authority consolidates itself. What is missing here is a clear articulation of necessity. There is no explicit finding that the child is in immediate danger. There is no documented impairment, no visible harm, no urgent medical concern. Yet the machinery of child removal is set in motion. This highlights a troubling reality. The threshold for initiating family separation can be far lower than the threshold for arrest. The man's language grows sharper as he realizes what is at stake. He interprets the officer's actions not as concern for his child, but as punishment for noncompliance. Whether or not that is the officer's intent, the perception is understandable. From his perspective, the sequence is clear. He questioned authority, resisted an unexplained command, and now faces the potential loss of his child. This perceived cause-and-effect relationship is corrosive to public trust. It reinforces the belief that rights are conditional, that cooperation must be immediate and unquestioning, and that any assertion of autonomy can trigger disproportionate consequences. In this environment, compliance is not about safety yet, it is about survival. The officers continue to gather information, but the process lacks transparency. The man is not clearly told what specific behavior has triggered child services involvement. He is not given a roadmap for how to prevent it. Instead, he is presented with a binary reality: comply now, or the system will proceed without you. This is not informed consent, it is coercion through uncertainty. As the discussion unfolds, institutional roles blur. Law enforcement officers begin making determinations that border on social work judgments. They weigh family arrangements, availability of caregivers, and parental fitness, all without specialized training or comprehensive information. This is a structural problem, not an individual one. Systems designed for enforcement are poorly suited to nuanced family decisions, yet they are routinely placed in this position. The man attempts to reassert his humanity. He emphasizes continuity, love, responsibility. He pushes back against the implied narrative that he is transient or unreliable. But these assertions no longer influence the outcome. Once the child welfare pathway is activated, the encounter follows a predetermined script. The officer's role shifts from decision-makers to facilitators of a process already in motion. This is where the bodycam footage becomes especially revealing. Not because of overt misconduct, but because of what it shows about institutional inertia. No one pauses to reassess whether escalation has actually improved safety. No one revisits the initial justification for the stop or the detention. The system does not self-correct, it advances. The emotional temperature continues to rise, but the officer's responses remain procedural. This mismatch exacerbates the conflict. The man feels unheard, the officers feel challenged. Each side interprets the other through a lens shaped by their role. The camera captures not just words, but the growing gap between lived experience and institutional logic. When the man uses strong language to defend his role as a father, it is met with warnings rather than understanding. Threats of additional charges or consequences hang implicitly in the air. The message is clear: emotional expression is risky. Silence would be safer. This expectation that citizens must suppress natural reactions to avoid punishment reveals a profound imbalance in how power is exercised. The child, meanwhile, remains largely invisible as an individual. She is referenced, but not centered. Her needs are discussed abstractly, detached from her relationship with her father. This is one of the paradoxes of child welfare involvement in law enforcement contexts. The system claims to act in the child's best interest, while often disregarding the emotional trauma of sudden separation. As the officers communicate with dispatch and other agencies, the encounter expands beyond the immediate scene. The father's fate and his child's become subject to decisions made by people who have never met them. This diffusion of responsibility makes accountability elusive. Each participant is following protocol, yet the cumulative effect is deeply personal and potentially devastating. The man's frustration peaks as he realizes that his cooperation at this stage may not change the outcome. This is a critical moment. When individuals perceive that compliance no longer offers relief, the risk of escalation increases. Ironically, systems designed to enforce order can create the very instability they claim to prevent. Throughout this phase, the body camera captures a fundamental tension in modern policing: the expansion of authority without a corresponding expansion of responsibility. Officers wield significant power over family integrity, yet the standards guiding that power are often vague and inconsistently applied. The result is a landscape where life-altering decisions can hinge on subjective interpretations made under stress. The narrative that unfolds is not one of villains and heroes. It is one of systems interacting with human beings in ways that prioritize control over care. The officers may believe they are acting prudently. The father believes he is being punished unfairly. Both perceptions coexist, but only one carries institutional weight. By the end of this segment, the outcome feels increasingly inevitable. The process has momentum. The father's objections are noted but not integrated. The child's future for the next several hours or longer is being decided in real time without judicial oversight. This is the quiet power of administrative action. It does not require conviction, only compliance. In the final part, we will examine how encounters like this persist beyond the roadside, how reports are written, how narratives are formalized, and how accountability often dissolves once the cameras turn off. The consequences of this stop will not end here. They will echo through systems designed to protect, yet too often structured to overwhelm. Once the immediate confrontation subsides, the most consequential phase of the encounter begins quietly, almost invisibly. This is the phase that rarely makes headlines or thumbnails, yet it is where the long-term damage is often done. The body camera continues to record, but the narrative is no longer shaped by raised voices or physical commands. It is shaped by documentation, interpretation, and institutional memory. What matters now is not only what happened, but how it will be written down. Every law enforcement encounter ultimately becomes a story on paper. Reports translate chaotic, emotional moments into sanitized language. Tone replaces context. Interpretation replaces dialogue. And in that translation, power is preserved. The father's emotional reactions, previously dismissed as agitation, may now be logged as indicators of instability. His initial hesitation may be reframed as resistance. His concern for his child may be flattened into uncooperative behavior. This is where accountability often dissolves. Bodycam footage may capture nuance, but written reports determine outcomes. Prosecutors, child welfare officials, and supervisors are far more likely to read summaries than to review hours of video. If the report frames the encounter as necessary, measured, and justified, the system accepts it as truth. The father, meanwhile, leaves the scene carrying consequences that are neither immediate nor fully explained. He may not be charged with a crime, yet he has been subjected to detention. He may not be declared unfit, yet his child has been placed under external control. These outcomes exist in a gray zone where legal protections are weakest. There is no courtroom, no judge, no defense attorney present in the moment decisions are made. This is the paradox of modern enforcement power. The most intrusive actions often occur outside the formal criminal process. The bodycam footage reveals how easily this can happen. At no point is there a clear resetter moment where officers pause and reassess whether escalation has actually improved safety. Instead, each procedural step becomes its own justification. The initial stop leads to detention. Detention leads to concern. Concern leads to intervention. Intervention leads to separation. By the time anyone might question the necessity, the process is already complete. Institutional systems are built this way intentionally. Momentum reduces friction. Friction invites scrutiny. When actions feel inevitable, they are less likely to be challenged. Officers are trained to move forward, not backward. Reversal is seen as weakness. Reconsideration is framed as risk. For the father, challenging what happened later will be extraordinarily difficult. Complaints require specificity. Specificity requires knowledge of policy and law. Even then, internal reviews often default to officer discretion. The presence of a child complicates matters further. Agencies are reluctant to second-guess decisions framed as protective, even when harm is evident. This creates a near-immunity effect. Actions taken for safety are rarely punished, even if they were unnecessary. The threshold for justification is low, while the threshold for accountability is high. Bodycam footage, ironically, can reinforce this imbalance if it is interpreted selectively. The emotional cost, however, does not disappear. The father's trust in institutions is likely fractured. Future encounters with law enforcement will be colored by this experience. Compliance may come faster, but it will be driven by fear rather than respect. This is how cycles form. This is how communities learn that rights exist in theory, but not always in practice. The child's experience is harder to measure, but no less real. Sudden separation from a parent, even temporarily, can be destabilizing. The system often treats children as resilient by default, underestimating the impact of abrupt, unexplained changes. In prioritizing procedural correctness, emotional continuity is sacrificed. From an institutional perspective, the encounter may be logged as routine. No use of force report, no arrest, no injury. On paper, nothing went wrong. This is the most dangerous kind of failure, the kind that leaves no visible mark. Bodycam footage like this challenges that narrative. It exposes how authority can be misused without overt violence. It shows how tone, sequencing, and discretionary decisions shape outcomes more powerfully than statutes. It reveals that accountability is not just about preventing brutality, but about questioning everyday practices that quietly erode civil liberties. The officers involved may never reflect deeply on this stop. Training emphasizes outcomes, not introspection. If no supervisor flags the incident, it fades into the background noise of routine enforcement. The system moves on. The individual does not. This is why documentation matters. This is why analysis matters. Not to vilify, but to understand. Not to sensationalize, but to trace cause and effect. Encounters like this are not isolated incidents, they are data points in a broader pattern of authority exercised without sufficient restraint. What the bodycam ultimately captures is not a single moment of misconduct, but a chain of decisions, each one defensible in isolation. Together, deeply troubling. The failure is cumulative. It lies in how easily a citizen can be stripped of autonomy without clear justification, and how difficult it is to reclaim it afterward. The lesson here is not that officers should never act decisively, nor that child welfare should never intervene. It is that power demands precision. When authority is broad but accountability is narrow, harm becomes normalized. Systems drift toward control because control is efficient even when it is unjust. As the camera powers down, the official record begins its quiet work. Narratives harden. Outcomes are accepted. The opportunity for correction passes. What remains is a story, one that will be told differently depending on who is listening and which parts they choose to hear. This documentary exists to slow that process down, to examine the moments between commands and consequences, to show how easily rights can be overshadowed by procedure, and how important it is to question not just what officers do, but why they do it and what alternatives were ignored. Because the most important accountability does not happen in courtrooms or internal affairs offices. It happens when patterns are recognized, when assumptions are challenged, and when power is examined with the same rigor it demands of others. And it begins by watching closely.